When the red light fades, the dark side of TV's golden age. There's a mechanical click in every television studio just before a live broadcast. The red on-air light flashes. For the audience at home, that soft glow meant it was time for wholesome entertainment, a cozy night in front of the telly. But for decades across British television, that red light was nothing more than a temporary truce. The moment it switched off, the warm smiles didn't just fade, they evaporated into something cold, brutal, and utterly terrifying. We remember these 12 presenters as beloved national treasures, but to the crew trapped behind the cameras, they were absolute dictators. This is what really happened when the screen went black. Number 1. Jimmy Savile. There was a specific kind of silence that fell over a BBC television studio the second the red on-air light flicked off. It wasn't the relaxed exhale of a crew finally grabbing a break after a tense live show. It was a heavy, calculated quiet, the kind that settles in a room where everyone knows the real power isn't in the script, but in the man whose dressing room you never, ever entered uninvited. For decades, Jimmy Savile was packaged for the public as the eccentric, cigar-chomping, charity-mad uncle of British television. But to the camera operators, the floor managers, and the young runners, he wasn't a national treasure. He was a deeply entrenched systemic problem that nobody was allowed to point out. The terror on Savile's sets didn't usually look like explosive rage. It was structural, almost corporate. He held an unprecedented level of access, carrying keys that bypassed security across the entire BBC network and half the institutions in the country. As a technician or a production assistant, you learned the unwritten rules fast. You saw who was shepherded into his dressing room. You clocked the deeply disturbing patterns of his daily operations. But the hierarchy was absolute. Savile wasn't just a host, he was a protected asset, generating monster ratings and untouchable PR for the network. To question him, or to report what you saw in the corridors, was a guaranteed way to end your career before it even started. And that's what makes the archive footage so chilling. He didn't operate in the shadows. He operated in plain sight under those glaring studio lights, shielded by a massive institutional cover-up. Executives looked the other way, and the crew at the bottom of the ladder were trapped in a paralyzed culture of complicity, paid to keep the cameras rolling and carefully frame the smiling face of a man they knew was untouchable. It was the machinery of an entire industry working flawlessly to protect him. Number 2. Cilla Black. For a junior sound technician working at ITV in the 1990s, there was no task more nerve-shredding than clipping a microphone onto Cilla Black. The veteran staff taught you the protocol within your first hour: avoid direct eye contact, do not attempt casual conversation, and get your hands away from her as fast as physically possible. To the British public watching at home, she was the ultimate working-class success story, the warm, fiercely loyal fairy godmother of weekend television, famous for that infectious Liverpool charm and her easy banter on Blind Date. But from the vantage point of the gallery and the studio floor, the reality was starkly different. Her backstage demeanor was notoriously glacial. She rarely yelled or threw theatrical tantrums. She didn't have to. She maintained her absolute authority through a devastatingly effective form of silent, icy intimidation. This wasn't a host occasionally having a stressful day. This was the calculated deployment of status. She operated like a ruthless corporate executive who viewed the production staff not as collaborators, but as easily replaceable machinery. A pervasive anxiety rippled through the floor crew. A single misstep, or even just catching her in the wrong mood, could result in a quiet word to the producers and your immediate, unexplained removal from the filming schedule. The most unsettling bit for the crew wasn't the hostility itself, but the mechanical precision of her on-screen transition. You'd be standing 3 feet away, watching a woman with a face of pure stone, exuding complete indifference toward everyone in the room. Then the floor manager would count down from 3, the camera light would glow red, and instantly that famous beaming smile would snap into place like a mask. It was a flawless, terrifyingly rapid performance. For the people standing in the shadows behind the cameras, witnessing that instantaneous flip from backstage tyrant to national sweetheart was a daily reminder of exactly where the power lay. Number 3. Huey Green. In the production offices of Opportunity Knocks during the 1970s, the sound of a ringing telephone often brought a creeping sense of dread to the editorial staff. If it was Huey Green on the line, the conversation was rarely about improving the broadcast. It was an interrogation. On television, Green was the enthusiastic pioneer of the British talent show, the man with the booming voice standing in front of the nation, relentlessly encouraging ordinary working-class people to chase their dreams. He sold hope. But for the researchers, floor managers, and producers working behind the scenes, hope was the last thing they felt. The atmosphere he cultivated wasn't just difficult, it was clinically paranoid. Green didn't typically rely on explosive tantrums on the studio floor. Instead, he wielded his influence like a corporate mob boss. The terror he inflicted was deeply bureaucratic. He weaponized contracts, using the legal and financial complexities of television production to keep his crew in a constant state of anxiety. He kept detailed mental files on perceived slights. If a junior producer or a technician dared challenge his direction, they wouldn't just be reprimanded. Green would actively use his immense industry leverage to ensure they were blacklisted from working anywhere else on the network. Working on his set meant operating under a regime of strict, unspoken surveillance, where he frequently pitted colleagues against one another, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing anyone who showed a flicker of independence. The crew functioned in survival mode, carefully navigating his shifting suspicions just to protect their livelihoods. There is a deeply cynical paradox at the core of his career. The man who built his entire public legacy on opening doors for amateur singers and comedians spent his off-camera life meticulously locking the doors on the professionals forced to work beneath him. Number 4. Fanny Craddock. For the audio engineers manning the mixing desks at the BBC, a Fanny Craddock rehearsal was something you learned to monitor with the volume deliberately turned down. The live feed was less about checking microphone levels and more about bracing for impact. To the British viewers of the 1960s and 70s, she was culinary royalty. She brought high society elegance into middle-class living rooms, cooking complex dishes in immaculate evening gowns with absolute patrician authority. But on the studio floor, that same authority morphed into a deeply uncomfortable psychological blood sport. For the camera operators, lighting technicians, and floor runners, her set wasn't just stressful. It was an active arena of public humiliation. She didn't operate through quiet backstage threats or closed-door meetings. She used the open, echoing space of the studio to assert her dominance. If a prop was slightly misaligned or a camera panned a second too late, she didn't just correct the mistake. She would systematically dismantle the crew member's dignity, deploying vicious classist insults while 50 other professionals were forced to stand in a dead, suffocating silence. The cruelty wasn't a loss of temper. It was her chosen method of maintaining discipline. The most chilling aspect for the production team was watching her direct this exact venom at her own husband and on-screen assistant, Johnny. The crew had to stand perfectly still in the sweltering heat of the studio lights, forced to be silent witnesses as a woman stripped her partner of basic respect, take after take. You didn't intervene. You just focused entirely on your equipment, praying her crosshairs wouldn't pivot in your direction. Her eventual television exile, sparked when she ruthlessly mocked a vulnerable amateur cook on a live broadcast, shocked the nation. But for the technicians who had spent years dodging her verbal shrapnel, there was no surprise at all. It was simply the day the red light finally failed to hide the reality they lived with every week. Number 5. John McCririck. For a junior runner freezing on a rain-swept British racecourse at 7 in the morning, being assigned to John McCririck wasn't just a tough shift. It was an endurance test in basic human degradation. To the millions watching Channel 4 racing, he was a pantomime character. With his deerstalker hat, his massive gold rings, and those wild theatrical hand gestures, he was the harmless, eccentric face of sports betting. But off-camera, among the thick cables and the muddy broadcast trucks, that eccentricity was a highly effective weapon. He used his carefully crafted character as an impenetrable shield for outright bullying. The terror he instilled didn't happen in closed dressing rooms. It happened out in the open, usually directed at the most vulnerable people on the production ladder. The camera operators and sound technicians watched daily as he ruthlessly demeaned young female assistants, treating them with a level of open, unapologetic misogyny that was entirely normalized by the production environment. If you brought him the wrong tea or missed a minor cue, you weren't just corrected. You were publicly berated, stripped of your dignity by a man who knew precisely that no floor manager would ever step in to defend you. The real horror of his behavior was the institutional excuse that sustained it. The network executives and senior producers operated on a frustratingly simple logic. That's just John being John. Because his on-screen brand was built on being loud, obnoxious, and politically incorrect, he was granted a terrifying amount of leeway to mirror that behavior toward his own crew. As a technician, working on his broadcast was a study in profound cognitive dissonance. You would see him verbally obliterate a terrified runner, leaving them shaking by the side of the track, and then the director would count down, the camera would roll, and he would instantly launch into his comical, frantic waving for the viewers at home. He didn't have to hide his toxicity because the industry had simply decided that his cruelty was just part of the entertainment. Number 6. Paul Daniels. In the dimly lit wings of the BBC television centre, the atmosphere during a Paul Daniels production was defined by sheer, unadulterated stress. For a prop master or a lighting rigger, working on his live broadcast wasn't about facilitating entertainment. It was about surviving a grueling exercise in absolute, unforgiving control. To the millions of families watching at home, he was the cheeky, quick-witted master of illusions, delivering wonder and comedy with a warm, accessible charm. But behind the curtain, the magic was sustained by a regime of deeply toxic micromanagement. Daniels operated with a crushing superiority complex. From his perspective, the production crew were not television professionals collaborating on a show. They were a constant liability that needed to be kept in line. The terror on his set stemmed from the fact that illusion requires mathematical precision, and he weaponized that requirement. A spotlight hitting its mark half a second late, or a prop placed an inch to the left, wouldn't just result in a ruined take. It would trigger a surgical, deeply humiliating dressing down. He didn't need to shout to establish dominance. He used a relentless, condescending arrogance, carefully dismantling a stagehand's professional dignity in front of the entire gallery just to remind everyone who held the intelligence in the room. He was notoriously resistant to any external input. If a seasoned director suggested a different camera angle, or a minor adjustment to the pacing, they were immediately met with a wall of hostility. "You'll like this." The greatest trick Paul Daniels ever pulled off wasn't a sleight of hand. It was convincing the British public that the joyful, smiling entertainer on their screens bore any resemblance to the cold, dictatorial. Number 7. Simon D. In the late 1960s, navigating the backstage corridors of the BBC during a Simon D. broadcast felt less like working on a light entertainment show and more like tiptoeing through an active minefield. To the millions tuning in twice a week, he was the absolute epicenter of swinging London, smooth, effortlessly cool, defining the cultural pulse of a generation. But for the production assistants and floor managers tasked with actually keeping his show on the rails, he was a rapidly escalating nightmare of unchecked megalomania. The terror on his set didn't stem from the calculated, icy control seen with other hosts. It came from a dangerous, volatile unpredictability. He was a man who seemed to believe his own myth so completely that he viewed the network and everyone working for it as his personal subjects. The demands he placed on the crew weren't just diva-like or unreasonable. They were designed to test total submission. If a junior coordinator failed to meet an absurd last-minute demand, or if a technician accidentally crossed his line of sight, they weren't just reprimanded. They faced a level of explosive hostility that frequently crossed the line from aggressive verbal abuse into overt physical intimidation. Working in his orbit meant dealing with a host who was fundamentally losing his grip on professional reality, treating veteran camera operators with absolute contempt, and turning the studio floor into a deeply hostile environment where pure anxiety replaced collaboration. But the most striking thing about Simon D.'s reign of terror is how the system finally reacted. He pushed the machinery of British television so hard, and treated its workers with such violent disrespect, that the executives quietly agreed to pull the plug. He went from being the biggest star in the country to a completely blacklisted exile almost overnight. For the crew members who had endured his abuse, it was a sudden, chilling reminder that even the brightest studio lights can be permanently switched off. Number 8. Benny Hill. In television production, a comedy set is usually characterized by noise, banter, loose energy, and genuine off-camera laughter. But the studio floor of the Benny Hill show operated with the grim, sterile efficiency of an assembly line. To the international audience watching his globally syndicated broadcasts, he was the harmless slapstick clown running in fast motion, chased by bikini-clad women to a jaunty saxophone tune. But for the camera operators and floor managers tasked with capturing that footage, the environment was devoid of any genuine warmth. It was an atmosphere defined by absolute, suffocating micromanagement. The terror he inflicted wasn't the explosive, shouting rage of other television titans. It was a cold, institutionalized exploitation. He wielded total dictatorial control over every frame, every gag, and most disturbingly, every person on his set. For the junior production staff, the most deeply uncomfortable aspect of the job was facilitating his casting and filming process. The women endlessly chased across the screen weren't treated as collaborative performers. To the crew watching from the shadows, it was painfully clear that these individuals were processed merely as disposable, highly objectified props. Working in his orbit required a sickening level of professional blindness. You saw the deeply inappropriate power dynamics playing out under the studio lights. You witnessed a deeply isolated man using the vast resources of Thames Television to construct a personal, highly transactional universe where his authority could never be challenged. If a crew member expressed discomfort with the rigid, uncomfortable atmosphere, the system quickly reminded them of the hierarchy. The network executives didn't just tolerate his behavior, they funded it, because his show was one of the most lucrative exports in British broadcasting history. The crew was paid to keep their heads down, focus the lenses, and capture the illusion of a carefree romp. Reviewing the archive today, the fast-paced chases and canned laughter don't feel comedic. They feel like a cynical smokescreen, carefully manufactured to hide an oppressive workplace where the star held absolute power, and everyone else was just a silent, expendable extra in his personal fantasy. Number 9. Rolf Harris. For the art department, and floor runners working at the BBC, the heavy squeak of a thick marker pen on a giant canvas was supposed to be the soundtrack of wholesome family entertainment. Whether presenting Rolf's Cartoon Club or crying over sick pets on Animal Hospital, Rolf Harris projected the ultimate grandfatherly warmth. He was the gentle, eccentric artist, universally beloved and entirely non-threatening. But for the young female production assistants navigating the backstage corridors, his presence demanded a very specific, deeply uncomfortable vigilance. The danger on his set was insidious because it was perfectly camouflaged by his public brand. Harris didn't rule the floor through explosive tantrums or aggressive dressing downs. His method of control was the quiet weaponization of his own approachability. He used his status as an untouchable national treasure to casually, relentlessly dismantle professional boundaries. From the perspective of the technical crew, you witnessed the slow-motion normalization of predatory behavior. You watched as he used the pretext of his tactile, jovial television persona to invade the personal space of vulnerable junior staff. The true horror of working in that environment was the collective paralysis of the production hierarchy. If a young runner looked visibly distressed after an interaction near his dressing room, the systemic response was a rehearsed institutional blindness. Senior producers would look the other way, attributing his deeply inappropriate physical contact to the quirks of an affectionate, eccentric artist from a different era. To stand behind the camera and focus the lens on his face as he offered comforting words to a grieving pet owner required a sickening level of cognitive dissonance. The crew was paid to actively manufacture a saintly aura for a man who was exploiting his television credentials to operate without consequence. When the studio lights went down, the set wasn't a place of creativity. It was a carefully protected hunting ground, secured by the willful ignorance of the entire industry. Number 10. Derek Ackara. Shooting a television show in the pitch black of an abandoned building is inherently stressful for a camera crew. You're navigating heavy audio equipment and thick cables through narrow, unseen corridors, relying entirely on the small, glowing green monitor of a night vision lens. For the technical team working on Most Haunted, the physical environment was difficult enough, but the real source of anxiety was the man standing in front of the lens. To the audience, Derek Ackroyd was a deeply sensitive, dramatic medium, a gentle conduit to the spiritual realm who presented himself as a vulnerable target for unseen forces. But the moment the director called cut, that spiritual vulnerability vanished instantly, replaced by a highly volatile, deeply insecure performer who demanded absolute compliance from the people working around him. The manipulation on his set was uniquely psychological. Ackroyd understood that the junior production assistants and runners were already isolated, cold, and naturally on edge in these haunted locations, and he used that engineered fear to his advantage. He didn't just rely on traditional shouting matches. He fostered an atmosphere where his gifts gave him unquestionable authority. Questioning a creative decision or a blown take didn't just mean arguing with a host. It meant challenging the entire supernatural premise of the production. The true terror of working in his orbit emerged when the illusion began to crack. When the show's own resident parapsychologist famously laid a trap, feeding the crew a fake entity named Creed Kafer, an anagram for Derek Faker, which Ackroyd then confidently claimed to channel on camera. The backstage fallout was radioactive. When confronted, he didn't retreat or apologize. He turned aggressively hostile toward the very production team he felt had humiliated him. For the camera operators trapped in the dark with him during those final shoots, the realization was chilling. The most dangerous presence in the room was never a ghost. It was a desperate man violently protecting a lucrative lie. Number 11, and Robinson. Ask any veteran BBC crew member what it was like to work on the weakest link in its 2000s heyday, and you'll see a flicker of genuine terror cross their face. And Robinson sold the public a very simple product, the Queen of Mean. That black leather wardrobe, those icy stares, and the crushing catchphrase, "You are the weakest link. Goodbye." The audience ate it up, believing it was just a clever bit of pantomime. But off camera, the act never stopped. She just wasn't wearing the leather. For the runners, floor managers, and junior producers, a studio day with Robinson was an exercise in ego suppression and survival. Her method of control was a scalpel-sharp tongue, wielded without warning. If a tea was handed over at the wrong temperature, or a script change wasn't communicated fast enough, she wouldn't just sigh. She'd look you dead in the eye and, in front of your colleagues, deliver a line so witheringly personal, so surgically designed to expose an insecurity, that it would leave you paralyzed. The crew joked darkly that the Mean was a 24/7 subscription, not a character. There was no warm-up, no aftercare, just the constant, corrosive feeling that you were an idiot for even breathing the same air. What made the experience so disorienting was the footage rolling in the control room alongside her tirade. You'd see the monitor feed, her back ramrod straight as she reduced the sound tech to tears. Then the countdown 3, 2, 1. The red light blinks on, and she's suddenly smirking, twinkling with that trademark acidic wit for the contestants, the camera catching every perfectly rehearsed arch of the eyebrow. It was a masterclass in controlled cruelty, a reminder that the joke was always, eventually, on the people who had to work with her. She convinced 15 million viewers it was entertainment, but the production teams knew it was simply a reign of verbal terror with a primetime slot. Number 12, Noel Edmonds. To the millions who grew up with multicolored Swap Shop, Noel's House Party, or the breathless suspense of Deal or No Deal, Noel Edmonds was the quirky, upbeat godfather of light entertainment, the grinning man with the prank-filled heart of gold who genuinely seemed to believe in cosmic positivity. But the crew trapped inside that television bubble will tell you the positivity was a one-way mirror. Step onto an Edmonds set, and you entered a cult of personality where his word was not just law, but divine prophecy. The terror here wasn't delivered through physical menace. It was a suffocating, paternalistic control dressed up as New Age philosophy. Edmonds had a reputation for creating an environment of walking on eggshells. He demanded absolute fealty to his creative vision and, famously, to his belief system. If a camera operator was caught emitting negative energy, or a producer privately questioned the narrative of a segment, they weren't just wrong, they were spiritually poisonous, and they'd be frozen out. The set could turn from a well-oiled machine into a silent, paranoid bunker in seconds. The most demoralizing aspect, according to former staff, was the sinister contrast between his on-screen benevolence and off-screen disdain. A runner could spend the morning being berated for a minor, invisible infraction of the Edmonds Code, only to watch him pivot instantly when the tally light came on, wrapping his arm around a member of the public, eyes glistening with manufactured empathy as he changed a contestant's life. That smile was a weaponized prop. In the gallery, you'd exchange the silent, exhausted glances of people who knew the truth. The man preaching joy and manifestation was, in the dim light of the studio floor, a micromanaging autocrat who treated career professionals like expendable disciples in a church built entirely for himself. So, who do you think was the most terrifying? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. And here's the thing. The golden age of television was full of these backstage monsters, and we've barely scratched the surface. If you made it to the end, you're clearly a fan of the real, hidden history. Do me a small favor, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell, because we're going to dig up even more secrets that the red light was never supposed to reveal. Thanks for watching.